the mudslinging, Mrs. McKenzie. That'll be 10 days suspended sentence and a $50 fine.
Here's something the network executives never put in the press releases. Some of the most beloved TV shows in history were one bad contract meeting away from complete implosion. Behind the laugh tracks and the theme songs and the carefully lit sets, there were actors who had had enough, writers packing their desks, and stars who looked their producers dead in the eye and said, "Not one more episode until you give us what we're worth." Today, we're counting down 13 beloved TV shows that had full-blown cast mutinies. And you'll want to stay buckled for number 1. Because what that cast pulled off didn't just save their own show, it rewrote the rules for every ensemble cast that came after them. Number 13, Night Court. If you grew up watching NBC's Thursday night lineup in the 1980s, you know Night Court, the show that followed the gloriously chaotic graveyard shift of a Manhattan municipal court, ran for 9 seasons from 1984 to 1992. And somehow made public defenders and bail hearings must-see television. Harry Anderson was the eccentric Judge Harry T. Stone, a magic-obsessed oddball who presided over the strangest parade of defendants this side of a fever dream. The ensemble cast was perfectly assembled. John Larroquette as the relentlessly sleazy prosecutor, Dan Fielding. Marky Post as public defender, Christine Sullivan. Richard Mall as Bull, the gentle giant bailiff. For most of its run, Night Court had the kind of chemistry that networks spend millions of dollars and 3 seasons desperately trying to manufacture. But chemistry doesn't always survive the back half of a 9-season run, especially when the man at the top starts believing his own press clippings. By the later seasons, Harry Anderson had developed a reputation for pushing back hard against producers over creative direction, clashing over tone, storylines, and what he felt was the show drifting away from the magic that made it work in the first place. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Night Court in its final seasons felt like a show going through the motions, unsure of what it wanted to be anymore. The real gut punch came when the show lost Shelley Hack, then Ellen Foley, and then Florence Stanley in a rotation of female cast members that felt less like creative decisions and more like the show desperately rearranging the furniture in a house it no longer recognized. Behind the scenes, morale was circling the drain. The cast that remained were professionals to the end, but Night Court in its twilight was a textbook case of what happens when a show outlives the goodwill of its own ensemble. Anderson walked away when it was over and was fairly candid in interviews about the disconnect that had developed. Sometimes the most honest thing a star can do is admit when the magic has left the building. Number 12, Baywatch. Let's talk about David Hasselhoff, the beach, and the concept of a man who decided that owning a piece of the show meant owning every conversation about the show. Baywatch ran for 11 seasons from 1989 to 2001. And became one of the most watched television programs on the entire planet. Slow motion running, lifeguard drama, red swimsuits, you know the deal. What you might not know is what was happening off the sand. When NBC canceled Baywatch after its first season, Hasselhoff did something genuinely ballsy. He helped buy the show back, became a producer, took it into syndication, and turned it into a global phenomenon. That's legitimately impressive, and nobody should take it away from him. The problem is that producing the show and starring in the show and owning a piece of the show eventually created a dynamic where the line between collaborator and boss got blurry in ways that made cast members deeply uncomfortable. Pamela Anderson, who joined the show in 1992 as CJ Parker and became arguably the most famous face in the entire franchise, was vocal about the tensions that came with working inside Hasselhoff's kingdom. Cast members who pushed back on creative decisions or tried to negotiate their standing on the show quickly discovered that the Hoff's grip on the production was absolute. Departures were common, storylines shifted, the beach always looked the same, but the people standing on it kept changing with a very little explanation. Hasselhoff himself later acknowledged in interviews that his role as both star and producer created complications that a more traditional setup might have avoided. That's a diplomatic way of saying that running the show from the inside, while also being the leading man, is a recipe for exactly the kind of quiet mutinies that Baywatch became famous for off-screen. The ocean is big. The egos were bigger. Number 11. The X-Files. Here is a sentence that should make every reasonable person's jaw drop. When The X-Files premiered on Fox in 1993, Gillian Anderson was offered half of David Duchovny's salary. Half. Same show, same hours, same paranormal conspiracies, same rain-soaked trench coats, half the money. Anderson pushed back, negotiated, and eventually reached pay parity with Duchovny, but the behind-the-scenes fallout from that original offer created fault lines on that set that quietly defined the show's entire run. Anderson has been remarkably candid about it in interviews over the years, describing the early experience as a crash course in the realities of being a woman in Hollywood. The initial offer also included a demand that she stand a step behind Duchovny during press appearances rather than side by side, a detail so staggering it almost sounds made up. It was not. When Anderson refused both the salary disparity and the staging arrangement, she set the tone for an on-set dynamic where she was not going to be treated as a supporting player in a show she co-headlined. To be clear, Anderson and Duchovny have both stated they maintained a professional and ultimately respectful working relationship. But professional and easy are two different things. The tension that simmered between the two leads for much of the show's run was never entirely invisible on screen. And behind the scenes, it gave the production an edge that kept everyone on their toes. By the time the show hit its peak in the mid-90s, Anderson was a star in her own right, winning an Emmy and a Golden Globe, and proving that having someone's paycheck is a spectacular way to guarantee they spend the next decade proving exactly how wrong you were. Number 10. Home Improvement. Tim Allen was the highest paid man on television for most of the 1990s. Tool time, grunt noises, neighbor Wilson dispensing wisdom over the back fence. Home Improvement was ABC's most valuable real estate from 1991 to 1999, and Allen's Tim Taylor was the undeniable star of the show. Nobody disputes that. What people forget is that Patricia Richardson was in every single episode, matched Allen beat for beat, and held the entire domestic center of the show together as Jill Taylor with a warmth and a wit that the series simply would not have survived without. So naturally, when contract time rolled around, she was treated like an afterthought. Richardson's fight for pay parity with Allen became one of the most quietly consequential salary battles of the decade, playing out largely away from the tabloids while bigger and louder negotiations grabbed the headlines. By the time the show reached its later seasons, Richardson had negotiated herself into a position of genuine leverage, but the path to get there was not smooth, and the frustration of fighting that battle while also having to show up and be warm and funny and professional in front of the cameras was something she didn't stay quiet about. When the show ended, Richardson was candid in interviews about her experiences negotiating on a set where the financial hierarchy didn't reflect what audiences actually saw on screen. Allen went on to Last Man Standing and a whole second act in television. Richardson worked steadily and selectively. But every time someone talks about the golden age of 1990s sitcoms without mentioning the pay gap that ran straight through the middle of it, just remember, Jill Taylor was standing right there in every single frame and had to fight like crazy to be paid like it. Number 9. Married with Children. In 1989, a Michigan housewife named Terry Ricolta watched an episode of Married with Children, decided it was the most morally offensive thing to ever air on American television, and proceeded to write letters to every advertiser on the show, demanding that they pull their support immediately. Several of them did. And Al Bundy's response to all of it was essentially a shrug, a beer from the couch, and a season that got more outrageous on purpose. But here's the part of the Married with Children story that gets less airtime. The cast and creators' relationship with Fox was a constant low-grade war. Ed O'Neill, Katie Sagal, Christina Applegate, and David Faustino were all fighting for a show that the network periodically seemed to want to sand down into something safer and more palatable. When Fox tried to introduce Seven in Season 7 as a soft, cuddly counterweight to the Bundys' collective dysfunction, we covered that whole disaster in a previous video. The cast's reaction behind the scenes was about as warm as Al Bundy's job satisfaction. Katie Sagal's real-life pregnancy complicated Season 6 in ways the show handled with one of the most genuinely shocking plot turns in sitcom history. A late miscarriage written into Peggy's storyline after Sagal lost her own child. Sagal has spoken about that period with extraordinary honesty, describing the experience of processing personal grief while simultaneously filming it as something she's never fully made peace with. The Ricolta controversy, the network pressure, the revolving door of cast members in the supporting roles, and the constant tension between what the show wanted to be and what Fox occasionally wanted it to be, made Married with Children one of the scrappiest casts on television. They survived by holding together when everything around them was trying to pull the show apart. Number 8. MASH. 3 cast members walked away from the highest-rated show on American television. Let that sit for a second. MASH ran from 1972 to 1983 and was not just a hit. It was a cultural institution. The series finale in 1983 drew 106 million viewers, a record that still stands. And yet somewhere in the middle of all that success, McLean Stevenson, who played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, decided he was bigger than the show. Stevenson left after season 3, convinced he was a solo star waiting to happen. His departure was handled in one of the most devastating episode endings in television history. And we won't spoil it here on the off chance that somehow you haven't seen it yet, but just know it hits like a freight train. Wayne Rogers, who played Trapper John, didn't even go through official channels. He just stopped showing up. His exit was so abrupt that the production had to scramble to write him out between seasons. And then Larry Linville, who played the magnificent and magnificently ridiculous Frank Burns, left after season 5 feeling the character had nowhere left to grow. The cast that remained, Alan Alda, Loretta Swit, Mike Farrell, Harry Morgan, Jamie Farr, and David Ogden Stiers, had to absorb each departure and keep a show about the emotional cost of war, emotionally honest through all of it. What's remarkable is that they did. MASH didn't just survive its cast mutinies. It got richer with each rebuild, largely because the remaining ensemble refused to let the departures define the show. The lesson MASH taught Hollywood was a hard one. No one is bigger than a great ensemble, not even the people who think they are. Number 7. Roseanne. By season 3 of Roseanne, the writer's room wasn't a writer's room anymore. It was a filter. Material went in, Roseanne Barr and Tom Arnold looked at it, and whatever came out the other side was whatever they decided it was going to be. The show that had broken genuinely new ground in its first season as an unflinching portrait of working-class American life was slowly becoming something else entirely, a vehicle, and everyone inside the machine could feel it. Roseanne ran from 1988 to 1997 and went through head writers the way the Bundys went through Dignity. Roughly a dozen showrunners cycled through the production over the course of the series' run, with many of them leaving under circumstances that ranged from uncomfortable to genuinely hostile. Barr's control over the show was total, and she made no apologies for it. Her argument was simple: this is my life. These are my stories. Nobody else gets to decide how they're told. And in the early seasons, that creative ownership produced something extraordinary. But the cast caught in the middle of the Barr and Arnold era were in an impossible position. John Goodman, Laurie Metcalf, and Sarah Gilbert were professionals of the highest order, grinding through a production environment that was, by multiple accounts, exhausting and unpredictable. Goodman in particular has spoken candidly about the toll those years took on him personally. The show remained a ratings success through most of its run, which is either a testament to the cast's talent or evidence that audiences will follow great characters through almost anything. Probably both. The infamous season 9, which introduced a lottery win and went completely off the rails, was Roseanne's production essentially eating itself. But that's a whole other video. Number 6. Grace Under Fire. Here is a number for you. 18, as in the number of writers who quit or were fired from the Grace Under Fire writing staff in a single year. 1 year, 18 writers. For context, most television shows have writing staffs of 8 to 12 people. Brett Butler's ABC sitcom about a divorced Southern woman rebuilding her life after escaping an abusive marriage was one of the biggest hits of the mid-1990s, pulling in 30 million viewers at its peak. 30 million people watching Brett Butler navigate single motherhood while cracking sharp, self-aware jokes. The show worked because Butler worked, and the show fell apart because Butler was falling apart at exactly the same time. Butler has been extraordinarily candid in the years since about her addiction during that period, describing a production that increasingly revolved around managing her condition rather than making television. Cast members arrived to sets where scripts hadn't been written, or had been written and then rewritten in the middle of the night, or had been handed to Butler, who made significant changes before anyone else saw them. The rotating staff of writers wasn't just a creative instability problem, it was a survival mechanism. People were leaving because staying wasn't workable. The cast, including Dave Thomas and John Paul Stewart, were essentially showing up to work and hoping for the best in conditions that would have tested the patience of far more seasoned industry veterans. ABC canceled the show in 1998 after 5 seasons, with Butler herself later saying it was the right call, acknowledging that she was in no condition to be running a production of that scale. She got sober, she rebuilt, and she has spoken about those years with a level of honesty that's genuinely admirable. Grace Under Fire deserves to be remembered for what it was at its best, which was very good television. But its collapse is one of the starkest examples in this entire countdown of what happens when a production loses its center. Number 5. Growing Pains. Kirk Cameron found Jesus in 1988. His castmates found the whole situation extremely inconvenient. Growing Pains ran from 1985 to 1992 on ABC and followed the Seaver family through the kind of warm-hearted suburban sitcom chaos that defined TGIF before TGIF even existed. Cameron was Mike Seaver, the charming, mischievous teen heartthrob who made Tiger Beat magazine's circulation numbers very happy. He was the show's breakout star, and he knew it. After becoming a born-again Christian, Cameron began approaching his role with a set of moral and creative demands that went considerably beyond script notes. He objected to storylines he felt conflicted with his faith. He pushed back against guest casting decisions on similar grounds. And, in the most seismic moment of the entire Growing Pains run, he was directly responsible for getting his co-star, Julie McCullough, fired from the show. McCullough, who played Mike Seaver's girlfriend Julie Costello, had previously posed for Playboy, and Cameron reportedly made clear to producers that he was not comfortable working with her. She was let go. The rest of the cast's reaction to watching a colleague lose her job because of their co-star's personal convictions was not warm. Alan Thicke, Joanna Kearns, Tracy Gold, and Jeremy Miller were seasoned professionals who showed up and did the work regardless of what was happening around them. But the environment on that set in the later seasons was described by multiple sources as tense and fractured in ways that never fully healed. Cameron has stood by his convictions consistently throughout his life and career, but for the people who were just trying to make a family sitcom in Burbank, his transformation from teen idol to on-set moral authority was a transition nobody had signed up for. Growing Pains ended in 1992. The Seaver family said goodbye. Not everyone was sorry to see the filming stop. Number 4. Designing Women. When the producers of Designing Women fired Delta Burke in 1991, they made a calculation. The show was bigger than any one character. The ensemble would absorb the hit and keep going. What they had not fully accounted for was that the ensemble had opinions. Very loud, very southern, very specifically furious opinions. Annie Potts was livid. Dixie Carter made her feelings known in terms that reportedly left nobody in any doubt about where she stood. And Jean Smart, who played the lovably ditzy Charlene Frazier, decided she was done entirely and walked straight out the door behind Burke after the start of season 6. One firing had accidentally destabilized 4 women, who together formed the absolute backbone of one of the sharpest sitcoms of the 1980s. Designing Women ran from 1986 to 1993 and was, at its peak, essential television. 4 Southern women running an interior design firm in Atlanta, written with a political wit and a feminist spine that was genuinely rare on network television at the time. The Burke firing, which we covered in depth in a previous video, came after years of escalating tension between her and creators Linda Bloodworth Thomason and Harry Thomason over creative control, working conditions, and a tabloid feeding frenzy around Burke's weight that made an already complicated situation worse. But the aftermath of that firing is the part of the story that gets overlooked. Potts stayed, Carter stayed, and delivered some of the finest work of her career in the final seasons. The show found new cast members in Julia Duffy and Judith Ivey, and it limped forward with enough talent to stay on the air, but not enough of its original magic to recapture what had made it essential. Designing Women without its original 4 is like a band missing half its founding lineup. Technically the same name, completely different song. Number 3. Cheers. The ensemble cast of Cheers essentially invented the group salary negotiation as a weapon, and American television has never been the same since. Cheers ran from 1982 to 1993 on NBC and is widely regarded as one of the greatest sitcoms ever produced. Sam, Diane, Carla, Cliff, Norm, Frasier, Lilith, Woody, Rebecca. It was a perfect machine. And somewhere around the time that perfect machine started generating enormous syndication money for everyone except the people whose faces were on it, the cast decided enough was enough. The salary renegotiations on Cheers in the late 1980s were landmark moments in television labor history. Ted Danson eventually negotiated himself into the neighborhood of $450,000 per episode by the show's final seasons, making him the highest paid television actor in history at the time. But the groundwork for that negotiation wasn't laid by one star working alone. It was laid by an ensemble that understood collectively that their combined leverage was far greater than any single player negotiating in isolation. The cast of Cheers figured out something that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. The chemistry between all of them together was the product. Not any individual performance, not any single storyline. All of them, in that bar, talking to each other, was the thing NBC was selling. And if NBC wanted to keep selling it, they were going to have to pay for all of it. Together. When Shelley Long left in 1987, which we've covered previously, the remaining cast didn't fracture. They regrouped, absorbed Kirstie Alley, and kept pushing. By the time the finale aired in 1993 and 93 million people watched Sam Malone flip that bar sign for the last time, the cast of Cheers had negotiated themselves into a position that made them the blueprint. And 2 shows down the road from NBC was already paying very close attention. Number 2. Seinfeld. In 1997, Jason Alexander, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and Michael Richards walked into NBC's offices together, 3 actors. One demand, $1 million each per episode, or the show was over. If you want to understand how genuinely unprecedented that number was at the time, consider that the entire per-episode budget of an average network sitcom in the mid-90s was somewhere in the range of $1 to $2 million for the whole production. These 3 actors were asking for $1 million each, together, on top of whatever Jerry Seinfeld was already making. NBC blinked. All 3 got their $1 million. And Seinfeld's final seasons became the most watched television on the planet, with the series finale in 1998 drawing 76 million viewers. So, from a purely mathematical standpoint, NBC's investment paid off in advertising revenue many times over. But the precedent set by that negotiation sent shockwaves through every network, every studio, and every contract renewal conversation happening anywhere in Hollywood at the time. What Alexander, Louis-Dreyfus, and Richards understood, building directly on what the Cheers cast had pioneered, was that Seinfeld without George, Elaine, and Kramer was not Seinfeld. It was a man in an apartment making observations about dry cleaning. Jerry Seinfeld himself, who by that point was already the highest paid entertainer in the world according to Forbes, supported his cast's push. The show had been built on 4 equal pillars, and he was not interested in pretending otherwise just to save the network a few $1 million. The solidarity between those 4 principles was absolute, and it is the reason that number is still referenced in entertainment industry negotiations today. But as revolutionary as the Seinfeld negotiation was, it was actually the second draft of a playbook that had been written the year before on a different network by 6 people who decided to walk in together and not walk out until they had changed the game permanently. Number 1, Friends. 6 actors, 1 united front, equal pay, $1 million per episode, each. The cast of Friends didn't just negotiate a contract in 1996. They rewrote the entire rulebook for how ensemble television casts fight for their worth, and every cast that came after them owes them a very large thank you note and probably a fruit basket. Friends premiered on NBC in 1994, and within 2 seasons had become the most watched show on American television. Jennifer Aniston, Courtney Cox, Lisa Kudrow, Matt LeBlanc, Matthew Perry, and David Schwimmer were 6 distinct personalities with 6 distinct comedic voices that together created something that networks spend decades and billions of dollars trying to replicate and almost never do. The chemistry between those 6 people was so immediate and so specific that audiences felt it from the pilot. Ross and Rachel, Chandler and Monica, Joey being Joey, Phoebe singing about a smelly cat, the whole package. By the time the first contract renegotiations rolled around after season 2, NBC was already pulling in enormous advertising revenue from the show, and the cast knew it. What they did next is the thing that gets taught in entertainment law courses. All 6 of them decided they were not negotiating individually. They were negotiating together, as a unit, with a single unified number. If you want one of us, you get all of us, and you pay all of us the same. No star system, no pecking order. No Jennifer Aniston getting more because her haircut had launched 1,000 salon visits across America. Equal pay for all 6, or the whole deal falls apart. Jennifer Aniston and David Schwimmer were considered the biggest stars at the time, and both of them reportedly made the deliberate choice to bring everyone else up to their level rather than use their individual leverage to negotiate higher for themselves. That decision, that specific act of solidarity, is the reason that number 1 became $1 million per episode per actor for the final seasons, making the 6 of them the highest paid ensemble in television history at the time. The Seinfeld cast would follow their lead the following year. Ensemble casts all the way up to the present day have used the Friends negotiation as both a template and an argument. But here's the part of the Friends story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The equal pay structure wasn't just about money. It was about what money represents on a set. When everyone is earning the same, the dynamic between the actors changes. There's no hierarchy built into the paycheck. Nobody can be played off against anyone else. Nobody can be isolated, underpaid, and made to feel expendable. The 6 of them understood that their collective leverage was only collective as long as they protected it together. They protected it together for 10 seasons, 236 episodes, and one of the most watched series finales in television history. The finale in 2004 drew 52 million viewers. Jennifer Aniston went on to become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet before returning to television with The Morning Show. Courtney Cox created and produced her own projects. Lisa Kudrow became one of the most respected comedic actresses working in the industry. Matt LeBlanc got his own spin-off in Joey, which we will graciously decline to discuss in detail here, and later, the brilliant episodes on Showtime. Matthew Perry had a complicated and beautiful and heartbreaking journey in the years after Friends that ended far too soon when he passed away in 2023. And David Schwimmer moved between film, theater, and television, with the range of someone who always knew he was more than the guy who was on a break. 6 people walked into a negotiation together and refused to walk out until the number was right for all of them. They didn't do it just for themselves. They did it for every ensemble cast that came after them. And that is why Friends sits at number 1 on this countdown. Not just for what happened on screen, for what they pulled off in that conference room. And that is a wrap on 13 TV shows that had cast mutinies, salary battles, creative wars, and behind-the-scenes implosions that never quite made it into the opening credits.